Welcome to the Arrive Podcast, the U.S. immigration podcast for Canadians. I'm Jeremy Richards, along with Christine Jerusik. Together, we simplify U.S. immigration, answer your questions, and share real-world experiences. Subscribe and share for U.S. immigration insights. This is the Arrive Podcast, the U.S. immigration podcast for Canadians. Welcome back to the Arrive Podcast. It's been a little while. It's been a while since Christine joined us.
Hello.
The last time we had Comby as a guest on the show and talked about his path to becoming a U.S. citizen. So today we're back on track with our typical format for the podcast. Today we will be discussing some visa options for Canadians and specifically Canadian nurses. And if you're a Canadian nurse, what are your options to come to the United States to further your profession in the U.S.? And we have represented many Canadian nurses when it comes to immigration matters, coming to the United States to further their career or pursue residency in the United States, permanent residency, a green card, and ultimately a pathway to citizenship. And nurses have an advantage over a lot of other professions. Number one, if you're Canadian and you're a nurse, you qualify for a TN visa. And we've talked about TN visas many times on the podcast before. If you're a Canadian nurse, and again, you have to be a U.S. or not a U.S. citizen, a Canadian citizen. You have to be a Canadian citizen, not a permanent resident to qualify for TN status. And if you have all the right documentation in order, you can just show up at a U.S. port of entry, apply for TN status, and then come to the U.S. and start working for a U.S. employer. I'm simplifying it, but if you have all the documentation in order, you don't have to go to a consulate. You don't have to file anything by mail with U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services. Nurses with the proper paperwork and offers from U.S. employers to work in the United States as registered nurses can show up at a port of entry, and then they're on their way. And so the ease of getting that work permit in the United States is because of the USMCA and the TN visa. Now, getting here on that and then working can turn into permanent residency and U.S. citizenship if done correctly for nurses. There are some things that nurses need to take into account. First of all, it's limited to nurses.
Registered nurses. And we get questions like, does a nurse practitioner qualify? No.
Not
for TN.
Not for TN. That's an advanced level of medical profession. It's not a registered nurse. It's above a registered nurse. And you have nurse and anesthesiologists, and you have all of these other professions within the medical field. Well, this is really limited to nurse practitioners. Or not nurse practitioners. Nurse practitioners don't qualify. Just registered nurses. Right. If you're a nurse practitioner, the visa option for you would be what's called an H-1B visa, and we've talked about those before. Good thing is a lot of nurse practitioners work for hospitals or that have affiliations with academic institutions, and that could open up the way to get an H-1B visa easier because they could be cap exempt, and we've discussed that here previously. But today we're just going to focus on nurses. So it is limited to registered nurses. Now, there are a few components you need to keep in mind if you're coming to the U.S., and we'll start with the TN work visa. First, and I already covered it, you must be a Canadian citizen. You cannot be a permanent resident. And you also have to have the necessary qualifications, and you have to get what's called a visa screen. And a visa screen is where there's a company that looks over your credentials and verifies them for their equivalence to the U.S. credentialing. And it doesn't matter where you went to school. And this can be somewhat confusing for registered nurses that came to the United States. They went to school and got their education here in the United States, and then now they want to work here. You would assume that since they were educated in the U.S., you can bypass what is called the visa screen. Not the case.
Right, because you'd think their education wouldn't need to be credentialed, right?
Yeah. since they received it in the United
US,
States.
But
it's
kinda
all
counterintuitive.
foreign workers. It doesn't matter. And it doesn't just apply to nurses. It applies to other professions too. And it doesn't just apply to TNs. It also applies to H-1Bs and green cards and stuff too. So this visa screen process, what they call a visa screen, is mandatory for foreign medical professionals to work in the United States. So in addition to having your education or your licensure as a nurse in the United States or your provincial license as a nurse, you have to get a visa screen that evaluates your credentials and shows that you are qualified to work in the United States as a registered nurse. So that's an additional hoop that nurses have to go through that other professions don't. You can't just simply rely on your license to practice as a registered nurse or your education. You have to get that added visa screen as part of the process. So let's assume you received a job offer in the United States, and typically these are going to be for hospitals is primarily where we do nurses for. A hospital gives you a job offer in the United States, work as a nurse, you have all your paperwork in order, and you present it at port of entry, and you get your TN. You had your visa screen, you had proof of your qualifications, and you're a Canadian citizen. Well, once you're here on that TN, the question we often get is, hey, you know what? I like it here. I don't want to go to the frozen north again. I want to stay here in the United States. A lot of these nursing jobs also happen to be in the South, so it's often very warm. I just got off the phone actually with a Canadian citizen previous to this recording this podcast, and they were talking about how almost the entire population of Canada is right there on the border. Right there on the border with the U.S. Yeah. Like once you start getting further away, there's a lot less Canadians, which is true. Canada is amazing. I love it. It's beautiful, but it can get cold, and some people want a little change in pace, and they like seasons, and they want to come down and to some warmer weather. So they get down here and they're working.
Did you say they like seasons? There's seasons in Canada.
Yeah, cold.
There's more than that, but
the warm season's very short.
We do get a lot of calls from nurses that are looking to relocate because of weather, for sure.
Also for opportunity, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot more opportunity in the United States, a lot more competition. You have 10 times the people in the United States than Canada. And we love Canada, so don't get me wrong. Absolutely love Canada. But some people want to immigrate to the United States.
I think it has to do with the rate of pay too, right? So strong U.S. dollar.
Yep.
Plus, because it's not, government healthcare here, you can really.
Most of these jobs, you're working for a hospital, so you get excellent healthcare. Right. That's what some Canadians don't understand. Oh, it's not universal health. Yeah, but if your employer's covering it and you're working for a hospital, you're going to get way better healthcare coverage.
And there's a lot of opportunities that aren't even with hospitals. So like travel nurses through staffing agencies and things like that. So
and they typically provide great benefits for their employees.
They do, yes.
Yeah.
And that's because there's a need here in the U.S. We need nurses.
Yep. And so, glad you brought up that point. So the U.S. government has identified that you need nurses. So that's why they're on the list of TN occupations, because we need them. So they put it on a TN occupation list to make it easier for Canadian nurses to get a visa to work in the U.S. And the other thing they've already identified for nurses is that it's a shortage area, and they have a special green card pathway if you are a nurse in the United States. And it falls under what's called a Schedule A profession. And Schedule A professions have been identified by the U.S. Department of Labor as an area of need. And typically, if you're hiring a foreign worker, you have to show that you have done what's called a test of the labor market. So you have to go out and you have to show that, hey, you know what? We need some nurses down here in South Texas. And you know what? We've interviewed, we've posted, and we're not getting anybody to apply. We can't fill these jobs. You typically have to post and go through that process and show, hey, we advertised for 3 months and nobody applied.
Yeah, call that recruitment.
Yeah. And now I want to hire a foreign worker because I have a foreign worker that wants the job. typically an employer has to go through this recruitment process to show to the U.S. government that they've done their due diligence to find a U.S. worker, and despite their best efforts, they can't do it. So now the U.S. then after you do that, you show this recruitment report to the United States government, and then they say, you know what, we agree. You did everything you could. We can see that you can't find U.S. workers. You're approved to give this job to a foreign worker. Well, the U.S. government has already predetermined that these are in-demand jobs, that we need nurses. So the U.S. government has said, you know what, for nurses, forget it. You don't have to recruit. You can just move forward with the green card process for a nurse.
Right. So those employers get to skip over that whole process, which is how many months is recruitment taking these days?
Well, even with the skipped recruitment process, let's see, it still takes about 2 years. So you're cutting
the whole process.
Yeah, you're with recruitment and prevailing wage determinations and everything that goes into that process, and certification of the 9089, which is the big deal. You're looking at a minimum of 2 years right now with the Department of Labor. So you're cutting 2 years off of a green card process because you are skipping the recruitment. So it's huge for Canadian nurses to have this advantage. And not just Canadian nurses. This actually applies to all nurses. Mm-hmm. But we're talking about Canadians here on TN status that they can use this program to skip recruitment and as a Schedule A profession that's been identified as in demand by the U.S. government and go straight to green card. Now, and most of the employers that we have seen are willing to do this because it's so hard for them to find U.S. workers for these jobs.
Right.
So most employers are willing to bear the cost and help their Canadian workers go through that green card process and get a green card. So the first step, find a job in the U.S., someone is willing to sponsor you for that TN. And then when you get here, then a lot of the times what we'll do is we'll tell our clients, have that discussion before you come to the U.S. A lot of employers will pre-commit to a green card process.
Right.
They'll say, we want you on a TN and we'll support you with that work visa process, the TN or whatever they need to get you. And then you can further that discussion and say, you know what? If this works out, let's say after 3 months, 6 months, or whatever you negotiate with them, hey, if you like me and I like you, will you help me with the green card? A lot of employers will put that into the contract up front. They may require a time commitment in order for them to do that, but most of them are willing because it's so hard for them to find qualified workers. So they're willing to assist you with that process. And that's a discussion you can have whenever you're comfortable having it with the employer. If they don't bring it up, maybe it is after a few months of employment. And you say, hey, I really like it here. I think I'm doing great. You know, can we make this long-term? Can we do a green card here? And have that discussion with your employer because this special program does exist for nurses.
Yeah, it is a big commitment, though, for an employer to go through that process, both economically, budget-wise and time-wise. There's a lot of things that the employer needs to do on your behalf. So it is a point of negotiation sometimes in that employment process.
Yep. And it's a commitment on both parts too, right? Mm-hmm. Because it's going to be a few years before you get this green card. So you need to make that decision whether or not you really like this employer and to go through that process. But even then, even if you don't like the job, I mean, stick around for a few tough years and get a green card out of it. That's my opinion.
Yeah, but the real... you're going through the process on the understanding that once you get the green card, you're going to work for this employer. So,
but at the same time, once you get the green card, you're not a slave.
You're not beholden to that employer anymore. You're not required to continue working for them.
They don't own you. You can go wherever.
Status.
Exactly. You can change employers once you have that green card, and you can exercise your freedom with that green card to work for another employer. And
employers know that too. So sometimes they're reluctant to go through the process knowing that it gives you job mobility.
Yeah, they're afraid you're going to get that green card and
yeah, so those are things to keep in mind while you're talking to your employer about this.
But amazing option. So if you're a nurse, not only do you have that quick path to the U.S. labor market with that TN, but then you have that expedited process to get a green card because it's been identified as an in-demand profession. Now, There are some things you need to keep in mind throughout the process. If you're on a TN, it does complicate it a little bit. When you go transition from a TN to a green card, there are travel considerations as well with that. There are also other things to consider, such as your spouse. So if you're in the U.S. on a TN, your spouse can come in on what's called a TD visa. But if this process takes several years, a lot of people are discouraged from the process because their spouse can come on a TD and be a dependent and live in the United States with them and could go to school, but they can't work. So sometimes that's a deal breaker for people because a spouse, they want to be together with their spouse, but they can work, but their spouse can't on a TD. Mm-hmm. So what does that mean? Well, that means spouse needs to qualify for their own separate work visa, whatever that might be based on their education and experience. So that can be a difficult component of this, which is odd. People question that in the immigration community all the time.
But there's also self-employed options too. So if your spouse is looking to open their own business or purchase an existing U.S. business and run that while you're here on a TN, that's another option for them too.
Yep. Get an investor visa. Mm-hmm. Or if you already own a business, there are other options depending on what the situation is. But in general, if you're on a TN, your spouse can't work on a TD, which is
we do get a lot of calls like that from people that are, hey, my spouse is an electrician and I'm a nurse, and
get that a lot, or in another trade or something else.
Yeah.
Yep. And those don't even qualify for a TN work visa, no matter what.
No.
So those people are out of luck. So that's a tough decision to make. Mm-hmm. Maybe a great opportunity for one spouse, but then it leaves the other spouse out. Children, for U.S. immigration, children are 21 years or younger, unmarried. They can come as well on a TD as a dependent and go to school, but they also cannot work.
Right, and we see that a lot with people that have kids that are maybe 16, 17 years old. Hey, my daughter or son wants to get a part-time job. Well, they can't work on their TD, so you're going to have to continue to support them, unfortunately.
Yep. So those are some of the complicating factors with the TN to green card process, and just working in the United States on a TN that can be discouraging to some people. And then the transition process as well. When you're transitioning, there are some complications with travel and other things that need to be taken into account when you go from a TN to a green card. But if done correctly, and again, there's this big myth out there that if you're under TN status or a TN visa, whatever way you want to call it, you can't get a green card. And that's because there is no direct path from a TN to a green card. There is no direct path. You have to use an alternative option, either through marriage to a U.S. citizen, through employer sponsorship, and this program that we talked about today, the Schedule A program for nurses. Those are all viable options to go from TN status to a green card if done properly. And we've helped many individuals go through this process to get TN status to work in the United States as a nurse, and then assisted their employers throughout the process to help them transition from TN status over to U.S. permanent residency and green card. Now, let's say you've done step one, you've got your work visa, then you did step two, you got your green card. Now what's next?
Citizenship.
That's where a lot of people are like, what about citizenship? Well, debunk one myth that's out there. A lot of the times people think, oh, I'm Canadian. If I become a U.S. citizen, I have to give up my Canadian passport and I won't be a Canadian citizenship anymore. Not true.
Not true.
Neither the United States or Canada will force you to give up your citizenship to become a citizen of the other country.
Yeah, they don't acknowledge dual citizenship. So when you show up at the border for either country, you just say, I'm Canadian if you're going to Canada. If they ask your citizenship when you're coming into the U.S., you say, I'm American. Because if you say I'm dual, the immigration officer is going to look at you like you got two heads. There's only one citizenship. If you're the citizen of that country, that's the one you state when you're coming in. You can have 2, 3, 4 passports and hold citizenship for multiple countries. Nobody's going to take that away from you. There are situations where you can't, but Canada, U.S., definitely allowed.
Yep. India, no. You become a Canadian citizen, you lose your Indian citizenship. And we run into that a lot with our Canadian clients.
Yeah, there's a lot of countries that don't allow it.
But the U.S. and Canada, they frown upon it, but they don't take away the citizenship of the other country if you become a citizen of either or. So, like you said, you travel to Canada, you're Canadian. Travel to the U.S., you're a U.S. citizen. So you can do it. You can go from a green card to U.S. citizenship. You have to have, if you're doing it through this path that we're talking about through employment, you have to have been a U.S. permanent resident for at least 5 years before you're going to and meet all of the criteria before you can then transition to U.S. citizenship.
That means living in the U.S., working in the U.S., spending most of your time in the U.S. for 5 years.
And that's what permanent residence means. That's where the permanent part comes in. This should be your where you work. This should be where you live. And that's kind of something that's difficult for people to switch in their brains when they go through this process. Canada, if you're going through this process, is now where you visit. You don't live in Canada anymore. You live in the United States, you visit Canada, which can be a hard thing to switch when you're used to having it the other way around. But if you're really becoming a U.S. citizen and you're a permanent resident, that's really what you need to do. You need to spend the majority of your time in the United States. You're living here, you're working here, and you're going back to Canada to visit at that point. But if you meet all the criteria and as a permanent resident, after 5 years, then you would qualify to apply for what is called naturalization. And you can become a U.S. citizen through the naturalization process. And then once you're a U.S. citizen, you're it for life.
Sponsor other people too.
And it opens up sponsorship. Yep. And if you have minor children and they're in the U.S. with you, there's opportunities for them to become a citizen through acquisition through you as a parent.
Or if you become a citizen and you need to bring your parents to the United States to care for them, or they want to come to the United States, you can sponsor your parents too.
Yep. So you have sponsorship options that open up as a U.S. citizen and many other things. And then it's permanent. It officially, if you gained it lawfully, it can't be taken away. So and then the restrictions of how much time you spend in the U.S. and things of that nature go away. You can spend 1 day a year in the United States if you want at that point. Once you're a U.S. citizen, you don't have to.
Or 0. You could move to Canada and live there the rest of your life, and you will get to keep your U.S. citizenship.
Or like the individual I just talked to on the phone, you can go to Saudi Arabia.
Oh, they wanted to go to Saudi Arabia.
and
definitely then warmer there.
And then you don't live in the United States or Canada anymore. Yeah. Now you're living in Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, we have lots of clients like that.
They just,
they get their citizenship and they move overseas.
And they do whatever they want at that point. Mm-hmm. And at that point, it's permanent. Unlike permanent residence or a green card, which is actually temporary, but it can be taken away. Citizenship, as long as it was gained lawfully, cannot be. And that's what that process looks like. So it's a great option for Canadian nurses that want to live and work in the United States. TN status is readily available. There's no limit on how many TN visas they issue each year to Canadian citizens. As many nurses that get the opportunity to work in the United States and sponsorship from a U.S. employer can come and get TNs at the border. And then as many employers that want to sponsor them for green cards can do so. But there is one catch.
You got to be a registered nurse.
You got to be a registered nurse, but with the green card process and the visa bulletin.
Right. Yeah.
So they only issue so many green cards a year. So even though they're issuing unlimited amounts of TNs, and as a Canadian, well, to ultimately receive that green card, it's subject to what is called the visa bulletin. And that is subject to your country of birth. It's not your country of citizenship. So depending on where you were born, the length of time it takes to actually get your green card could be, if you're a Canadian, could be a couple years. But, and when I say Canadian in this sense, I mean Canadian born. If you're a Canadian born Canadian citizen, it could be a couple of years. Whereas if you were an Indian born Canadian citizen, it could be 10 years because of the backlog. Because they only issue so many visas, or these are green immigrant visas or green cards per year, per category based on country of birth.
Right, and those countries of birth are China, India, Mexico, and the Philippines. If you're born in one of those countries, you're subject to a different timeline than everybody else in the world.
Everyone else in the world falls in the same bucket as Canada.
Right, the all chargeabilities area.
All other countries.
Yep.
Yeah. So again, if you're born in Mexico, Philippines, China, or India, you're going to have longer wait times.
Not necessarily. So some of the categories in some of the countries are the same as the all chargeability area right now, but a lot are also not the same. So
yeah. So it depends on your country of birth, and we can get more nuanced here. And if you're married to a Canadian-born Canadian, but you were born in India, well, then there's a cross chargeability rule where you can take advantage of your spouse's country of birth to speed you up in the process. Mm-hmm. So you wait according to your spouse's country of birth, not yours, because your spouse's wait time is shorter than yours. So it can get a little complicated. But the point is that process, the second step after you get the TN and now you want a green card, is subject to wait times, and because they only issue so many green cards a year per category per country of birth. So it's not a fast process where you show up to the border, you just get that TN and you're on the way. Well, it's going to be several years no matter where you were born in Canada, born in Mexico, India, Philippines, China, doesn't matter. You will be waiting to get a green card. None of these right now are what is called current, which means there is no wait time. You just wait for the government to process your paperwork. Right now, they're all backlogged. So not only you're waiting for your place in line, but you're also waiting for government processing on top of it. So you're talking years of wait, no matter where you were born. But the silver lining is at the end of this, you would get a green card, permanent residence, and then you'd be on your path to citizenship, as we discussed. So if you have any questions about working in the United States as a registered nurse, or the path to a green card through the Schedule A program as a registered nurse, or you're an employer who's looking to employ Canadians in the United States as registered nurses, we can help you out. We help Canadians all the time go to the United States to work and live under TN status, and also make that transition to a green card as well. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach back out to us. If you haven't already, please like and subscribe and share this channel with your friends and anyone out there who you think would find this content is interesting. Thank you for listening, and have a great day.